My name's Clive Hamilton. I'm sitting here in my apartment in Paris. I'm a visiting Australian academic. In Australia, I've been working and writing about the environment for perhaps 20 years or so. I've written a number of books which have had a little bit of influence, perhaps. I'm particularly concerned about climate change, the politics of climate change, the philosophy of environmentalism, and increasingly I'm concerned about the grand issues of the Anthropocene and what it means for humanity. And so I'm here in Paris for 2 months where there are a number of events happening in which I am involved. In November, there will be a major conference held in Paris on the Anthropocene, and I'm part of the organising committee for that conference. I'm very excited about that conference. I think it promises to be a landmark conference to help social scientists and those in the humanities get a grasp of the profound importance of this new geological epoch. Also, while I'm here in Paris, 2 of my books are being published in French. One of them, Requiem for a Species, or in French, Requiem pour l'espèce humaine, and a second book titled Earth Masters, or in French, Les Apprentis Sorciers du Climat. They've been published just last week, and so I'm here to do a number of events associated with those 2 books. So it's really been fascinating in my first 2 weeks here in Paris to try to get a sense of the environmental humanities and social sciences in France, to try to understand the subtle differences in the understanding of in intellectual life of these profoundly important issues. So I'm very pleased to be able to be here to do this interview. The Anthropocene. Well, we're now starting to realise that for the last 10,000 years, the era known geologically as the Holocene, the Earth has been asleep. It's been a 10,000-year period of extraordinary stability and calmness and clemency in the global climate, compared to the dramatic changes that were characteristic of the previous millions of years. And this stability allowed civilization to develop. And it was really allowed us, once civilization had developed and the modern era had arrived, to essentially ignore the natural environment, to ignore the natural world. And so what we're discovering now is that Earth system scientists are telling us something very profound, and that is that the slumbering beast has woken up in the form of the Anthropocene. So we're heading into a period, this century, of a dramatic change in the geographical history of the Earth, a change that's been brought about by the activities of humans themselves. And so what we're seeing is the collapse of the paradigm of the modern social sciences, which always assumed that nature and culture could be separated, that human history had its own internal dynamic determined by the activities of human beings, and meanwhile geological history, the history of the Earth, carried on slowly by itself and wasn't of much concern to us. And now we see, as Dipesh Chakrabarty has pointed out, these 2 histories have converged, and so no longer can we separate out human history and the evolution of human societies from what is happening in the Earth system itself. The 2 have clashed. As Heidegger would put it, Earth juts through into world. And so I think that this demands a total reconsideration of the social sciences and the modern humanities. The truth is that geology is no longer a concern only of geologists. It's a concern for all intellectuals because we're seeing the Earth impose itself. We've woken this slumbering beast and discovered that it's in no mood to be tolerant of these human beings who have prodded and poked and abused it so often that it's now had to come to life. So what we're seeing is a collapse of the separation of nature and culture, of the natural and the human. And no longer can we analyse them and think of them as separate. And that's why the Anthropocene is such a profound event for all of the social sciences and humanities. As you would expect, there is debate about the meaning of the Anthropocene and its implications. Let's see if we can try to untangle some of these disputes or disagreements. First of all, there's a disagreement among scientists, earth scientists, about the timing of the Anthropocene, when it began. Those who first proposed it suggested that it began in the late 18th century to coincide with the start of the Industrial Revolution. And the reason they nominated that time is very specific. I mean, obviously it's a scientific reason, and that is, from that time on, you can start to see in the record of the Earth system, the physical record of the Earth system, you can start to see the influence of human beings, not on this environment or that landscape or that lake or that forest, but on the Earth system as a whole. And this is the absolutely crucial point, on the Earth system as a whole. More recently, those scientists have said, well, actually, if we want to be absolutely certain about the Anthropocene, that is the age of humans in the evolution of the Earth system, perhaps it's safer to say that the Anthropocene began around about 1945 or 1950, when you can see on a whole lot of indicators a rapid acceleration in the impact of human beings on the Earth system. In the nitrogen cycle, the impact, of course, on the carbon cycle, and a range of other variables. And so this is where the term the Anthropocene comes from, okay? So it's the determination of the Earth system by the activities of humankind, rather than humankind simply transforming one landscape or another. Now, this view has been challenged by a couple of other scientists who claim that the Anthropocene in fact began 7,000 or 8,000 years ago with the start of settled agriculture and the clearing of forests. I'm not persuaded by that view, because although yes, you can see an increase in the record of emissions of methane and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, you can't easily detect, or detect at all, an impact of those increased emissions on the functioning of the Earth system as a whole. That's very much a part of the last century or two. But there are very deep kind of political implications of the selection of the date, because if you choose the end of the 18th century, then you're saying that it's not humankind that brought about the Anthropocene, but industrial man. It was industrialism, technological industrialism, that led to this transformation in the history of the geology of the Earth. Of course, that transformation was initially a capitalist industrialisation process, but we know from history that communist industrialisation has been just as environmentally destructive. In the old Soviet Union, there was a kind of complete disregard for the environmental damage resulting from Soviet industrialisation. Of course, we see what's happened in China today. Massive environmental damage from that strange hybrid of state and private industrial development. So it's technological man that has brought about this new geological epoch, not man in general. So you can see, and so that implies that maybe it should not be the Anthropocene, which suggests the scene, the new age, has come about as a result of the activities of the anthropos, humankind in general. Perhaps it would be better called the techno-scene, to reflect the idea that it's technological industrialism, whether capitalist or socialist, that has brought about this transformation of the Earth itself. But there's a further implication of this. If we do accept the scientific argument that the Anthropocene began 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, you can see that the interpretation becomes quite different. Then the Anthropocene becomes a result of human civilization, of humans moving out of their hunting and gathering phase and engaging in settled agriculture. And at that point, if that's true, then the Anthropocene is really a result of humans doing what humans do. Whereas if it happens from the industrial era, then it's a very specific type of human activity. And so the critique of the Anthropocene, or the interpretation of the implications of the Anthropocene, is heavily influenced by when you believe this new geological epoch began. So already we can see that there are some pretty substantial political and ideological implications arising out of this new epoch. So let me continue with this line of argument, because I think it's profoundly important for the social sciences to grasp some of these fundamental issues to see what is at stake when we take on board this notion of a new geological epoch and begin to think through the implications. I should point out that I think it will take us some decades to think through the implications, just as when we think of the arrival of modernity, it took perhaps 100 years for the philosophers and social scientists and historians to really grasp what was happening. But the implication I want to point to here is that there is an emerging school of thought, mostly an American school of thought, that talks about the good Anthropocene. In other words, that the Anthropocene, despite the fact that it arises out of a deep concern about climate change and the way it's transforming the Earth in ways that are often hostile to life, and certainly will be this century, there are some thinkers who are saying, no, this isn't a huge threat to humanity and the world. The good Anthropocene could indeed represent the opportunity for the greatest triumph of humanity. In other words, rather than attack industrial technology and cast doubt on its benefits, we should actually see the Anthropocene as an opportunity to develop that technological industrialism and the great ingenuity and creativity of humankind, to take it to an even higher level, so that the Anthropocene becomes something that we can celebrate rather than something that we must lament. The idea of the Anthropocene, this new geological epoch, has come about in large measure due to the consideration and research into climate change. Undoubtedly, the most enormous threat that humanity will face this century, and perhaps has ever faced. And now, one of the fascinating things to come out of this research is a recognition amongst climate scientists that the climate system cannot be separated from the other elements of the Earth system. That is the hydrological system. It can't be separated from the biological system, from the biosphere. It can't be separated from the cryosphere, the frozen parts of the Earth. And now we're discovering that the climate system having an impact on the geosphere itself, the crust of the Earth. Geological, seismic and even volcanic activity is expected to be affected by human-induced climatic change. So everything is in play. The whole Earth system is now being transformed by human-induced climate change, and that's why the Anthropocene is not just about the climate, it's about the change in the Earth system itself. And this prompts some very deep questions for social scientists, that we have to think about the Earth, this orb on which we live, in a very different way. Because it's in modernity, it's become accepted that humanity carries out its activities and engages in its plots and pursuits on a stage which has a background, a backdrop, the natural world, which is simply there as to kind of, you know, to provide the stage and the highlights on which we carry out this human drama. But now we have to accept that the background of this play has entered into the play itself and is influencing events in a profound way. The human drama can no longer be separated from the stage and the backdrop on which we previously thought it had been carried out. And one of the most profound features of this human drama that we've come to convince ourselves of in the modern era arises out of the European Enlightenment. And so we have this view of ourselves in modern times as essentially rational creatures who use our scientific knowledge of the world, of how it works, to understand what's happening around us, to foresee events that will be coming towards us, and to prepare and take actions in order to protect our welfare, our well-being. But what we see in the case of the climate crisis is that we have a vast body of scientific evidence in the form of climate science telling us that there is this enormous lorry, a pantechnicon, coming down the highway at us, and that we should do something about it, otherwise we're going to get killed. And yet, in the face of this scientific knowledge, in the face of all of these warnings, what are we doing? We're not turning the world around and protecting ourselves from dramatic changes to the Earth system due to human-induced climate change. We're prevaricating, we're denying, we're evading the facts. And so the gap between what the scientists say we must do in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and the actual greenhouse gas emissions that the world is putting out is increasing rather than decreasing. So are we creatures of the Enlightenment? Should we continue to flatter ourselves that we are rational creatures who use our science and our technology to change the world in ways that protect our well-being? I don't think we are, because we're simply not acting as enlightened creatures. We're not acting in our own enlightened self-interest, let alone the interest of other parts of the natural world. And so I think the notion of the enlightened creature, the animal rationalis, which is the foundation of the modern social sciences, is really collapsing around us. It's lying in a sullen heap on the floor. And yet we see in the social sciences, particularly in economics, in sociology, certainly in philosophy, the continuation of this assumption which grew out of the Enlightenment, which in the face of the climate crisis and the Anthropocene can no longer be sustained. One of the most peculiar and disturbing aspects of the global climate science debate has been the extraordinary success of the climate science denial movement, particularly in the United States and other Anglophone countries, but of course it's spread into continental Europe and other nations as well. And the essential strategy of the climate denial movement has been to spread doubt about the science of climate change. Initially, the climate denial movement in the United States was an industry-funded lobbying campaign sponsored by Exxon and other fossil fuel sources. But in the 2000s and mid-2000s, the climate denial campaign was transformed. It became absorbed into right-wing populism, especially the Tea Party movement in the United States. So it shifted away from being an industry-funded campaign into part of a much broader and deeper and more angry cultural dispute which is racking the United States particularly, and some other countries as well. And it became unpalatable for many cultural conservatives, and I'm thinking of the Tea Party and now the Tea Party domination of the Republican Party. It became unpalatable for them to accept the truth of climate science because the implications were too discomforting. They created too much cognitive dissonance. They would have to abandon too many profound beliefs if they were to accept the science of climate change. And so it became easier for them to claim that the science of climate change is bogus, is a conspiracy on the part of, well, you name it. I mean, even the Pentagon accepts it, so the Pentagon's in on the conspiracy as well. I mean, it's madness, and yet it's a very powerful form of madness, which has prevented the United States from adopting a position of leadership in the world on climate change action. But I think it goes beyond the hardline deniers, who are perhaps, you know, probably less than 15% of the population, even in the United States. I think there's a much broader portion of the populace who do not reject climate science, but are not willing to give it the kind of importance that the warnings suggest. In other words, they're willing to turn away from it, to filter it, to tell themselves, well, it can't be that bad, or the scientists can't make up their minds, or, you know, we'll muddle through and just not think about it. So I think this is what I call evasion, which is a much broader problem. And I think denial coupled with evasion has led us into this impasse, and which is having terrible consequences. And so for social scientists, this is a very sort of profound thing to consider. Why is it, in the face of this vast body of scientific evidence, there's probably more support for the science of human-induced climate change than for any other set of scientific claims, and yet it seems just too difficult for most countries to act in the way that seems necessary. So, and the consequences are going to be awful. They are awful to contemplate. And so I think the psychology of denial and the sociology of denial and evasion are events that really require the social sciences and the humanities to re-evaluate how they understand human beings and how they understand societies. As soon as we start to think about geoengineering, at least the grander technological schemes that are being researched as we speak, we have to think about humans in a different way. I mean, here we're talking about human beings in the 21st century using or attempting to use our technological power to take control of and to regulate the Earth system as a whole. I mean, it's hard to think of anything more grandiose than that. It's beyond space travel, it's beyond building nuclear bombs. It's talking about trying to manage the planet as a whole, to put it a sort of crude metaphor, to install a thermostat and to set it on the amount of warming that we humans think is optimal for our well-being. When you put it that way, of course you can come up with all sorts of practical difficulties that this will face. Who will have their hand on the thermostat? How will they decide where to set the global temperature? What if it's good for them but not for somebody else? What are the legal, strategic and military implications of that? Does it mean that if we have a thermostat we won't bother about reducing greenhouse gas emissions? What is the role of oil companies and fossil fuel lobbyists in all of this? All of these questions come to the fore. But in a way there's a deeper question, and that is what kind of being have we become when we believe that we have the capacity to use our creativity, our inventiveness, and therefore our technological power to regulate the planet as a whole in perpetuity, because it's very unlikely we will do this for a couple of decades and then back to business as usual. When we do this, if we were to begin to engineer the planet, then of course nothing would ever be natural again. Everything would have a human fingerprint on it. There may be, some kind of planetary regulatory agency somewhere that would be not just setting the global thermostat, but through that influencing every aspect of the Earth system. Are we capable of doing that? Is there a domain of, is there an ontological domain where humans should not trespass? Are there forms of power that we could have but we should not attempt to develop and utilise? Some people with a religious orientation might believe that attempting to control and to manage the planet is an instance of human beings attempting to play God, because after all we would need to approach a situation of omniscience, total knowledge, and omnipotence, total power. So there are some very deep ontological questions as well as ethical and religious questions thrown up by this proposal to geoengineer planet Earth. Here, I think, is the great dilemma of our times. How do we live with the unbearable truth of climate change? How do we keep going each day when the climate scientists, who themselves are despairing, tell us that we are wandering blindly into a century and beyond of climatic disaster? This is one of those questions that goes to the deepest aspects of being human. Of course, we know how most people are dealing with it. They're simply ignoring it. And, I have a kind of sympathy for that. It's an enormously heavy burden to carry around on a daily basis. But I quite often receive emails from particularly young people who've read one of my books, Requiem for a Species, that really paints a very bleak prospect based very soundly on the scientific projections. And they ask me, well, I've read your book, I don't know what to do with it. And I have to say I don't have a very good answer to that, except to say that Nietzsche once distinguished between what he called the pessimism of strength and the pessimism of weakness. The pessimism of weakness is to escape from the truth, to pretend that it's not there, and yet let it drive you into a life of instant gratification and hedonism and an abandonment of humanity. A pessimism of strength, on the other hand, is something that takes our human responsibilities very seriously, by which we say to ourselves, humanity faces this profound crisis. How can I maintain my dignity in the face of this truth? And to maintain our dignity, we must do something. I'm not saying we should fanatically devote our lives to campaigning or attempting to reduce our carbon footprints necessarily. I'm saying we should do something meaningful that, even if it makes no difference, at least will enable us to say, I tried. And around the world there are thousands of people making those efforts, people who have faced up to the full horror of the truth of climate scientists. And they seem to live by the maxim of St. Francis, who once said, even if I knew the world would end tomorrow, I would still plant this tree. For anyone who is willing to face up to the unbearable truth of climate science, to take the predictions of the climate scientists seriously, the future looks quite grim, to say the least. And so how do I confront that? How do I deal with that? Well, I have to say that, you know, when I read one article in particular that set out the story very, very clearly and in a very confronting way by a couple of British climate scientists. That was in 2008. I have to say it left me profoundly shocked for a long time, a couple of years. But in a way I'm lucky because I can write books about it. That's what I do. I attempt to alert other people to it, to engage in an activity that I hope will make a difference. I can't say that I think it has made a difference at this point, but at least I'm trying. So that's kind of an answer for what I do in my professional life. What do I do in my personal life? Well, I mean, I think it's very important for life to go on. Do you know what I mean? I mean, I sometimes have young people ask me, should I have children? Now, you know, I don't like being asked this question because, you know, who am I to tell people whether they should have children? But what I am willing to say is that for most people, having children is the most profoundly human thing that they can do, and that we should not ever give up on being human. So in a way, having a child is a kind of expression of hope that something will happen. We don't know what it is. It looks grim, it looks very grim, but having children is kind of investment in the future, or indeed becoming a grandparent. So that's what I do too. There's an important sense in which we must carry on being human and living our lives on a daily basis, even in the face of this terrible knowledge that we have to at times store away in the backs of our minds whilst we get on with life.